Today, we're talking about something that doesn't get said out loud nearly enough. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's deeply uncomfortable for people who thrive on control. When a narcissistic person betrays someone they believe is weak, replaceable, or dependent, they assume the story will end the way it always has for them. But sometimes they miscalculate. Sometimes they betray the wrong person. And when that happens, something irreversible begins, because the person they underestimated doesn't crumble. They wake up, they detach, they reclaim their clarity, their boundaries, their sense of self. And here's the part that truly destabilizes a narcissistic person. They don't get access to that transformation. They don't get closure, control, or the admiration they once fed on. Instead, they are left watching someone they tried to diminish rise without them. That loss of power, that permanent injury to their inflated self-image, is not something they recover from. This isn't about revenge, it's about reality, and once reality hits, there's no narrative they can spin that puts them back on top. There is a very specific moment in life when something quietly but permanently changes, and it often begins with betrayal. Not the obvious kind that explodes loudly, but the kind that cuts deep because it comes from someone who believed they had power over you. When a narcissistic person betrays you, they assume you will respond the way you always have, with self-doubt, with pleading, with attempts to explain yourself, with emotional labor designed to restore their comfort. They expect confusion, collapse, and compliance. What they do not anticipate is awakening. At first, betrayal hurts. It destabilizes your sense of reality. You question your judgment, your worth, your memory. But then something remarkable happens. The pain stops turning inward and starts sharpening outward into clarity. You begin to see patterns you once excused. You recognize manipulation where you once saw misunderstanding. You notice how often you shrank so they could feel tall. And that awareness is the moment power shifts. This shift is not dramatic. It does not come with speeches or confrontations. It shows up as emotional detachment, as silence where there once was over-explaining, as boundaries that no longer require justification. The narcissistic person senses this immediately. They feel the loss of access, the loss of control, the loss of emotional supply. And because their sense of self depends on dominance and validation, this shift feels catastrophic to them. What makes this moment so profound is that it does not rely on changing the narcissist. It relies on you returning to yourself. You stop seeking their approval. You stop trying to be understood by someone committed to misunderstanding you. You stop handing over your nervous system to someone who thrives on dysregulation, and as you stabilize, they unravel. Betrayal awakens the wrong person when it activates self-respect instead of self-blame, when it catalyzes growth instead of rumination, when it teaches you discernment instead of distrust. You become someone who can walk away without needing the other person to agree with your decision. That is power, and it is deeply threatening to someone whose identity is built on being indispensable. From this point forward, the dynamic can never return to what it was. Even if the narcissistic person attempts apologies, charm, or intimidation, it no longer works the same way. You have seen behind the curtain, you understand the cost of access to you, and that knowledge cannot be undone. The awakening is not about punishment, it is about alignment. You align your actions with your values. You align your time with your healing. You align your future with people who can meet you with reciprocity rather than entitlement. And while the narcissistic person may continue trying to rewrite the narrative, they are now doing it without you inside the story. The moment power shifts is the moment you realize you no longer need their version of reality to survive, to grow, to thrive, and that realization becomes the foundation of a life where you are no longer available for betrayal, because you are finally loyal to yourself, and once that loyalty is established, nothing and no one can take it away, even when they try to pull you back into the old cycle that once defined you but no longer does. Narcissistic control is not strength. It is a survival strategy built on fear, fragility, and an unsteady sense of self. In your life, this control may have looked like constant criticism, disguised as concern, emotional unpredictability that kept you on edge, or subtle rules that ensured you stayed focused on their needs rather than your own. As long as you were responsive, explaining yourself, seeking approval, or trying to keep the peace, the system worked for them. Control remained intact because you were still participating. The collapse begins when you stop participating. Not with confrontation, not with dramatic exits, but with emotional withdrawal. You no longer react the way you used to. You no longer rush to soothe, defend, or fix. Your nervous system starts to regulate, and theirs does not. Because narcissistic control depends on emotional access, once that access is restricted, their internal structure starts to fail. In your life, this may have shown up as sudden rage, confusion, or exaggerated victimhood. When control breaks, narcissists often cycle through tactics. They may attempt charm, then intimidation, then rewriting history. These are not signs of confidence. They are signs of panic. Without control, they are forced to face an internal emptiness they have spent a lifetime avoiding. And that emptiness is intolerable. What makes this moment so powerful for you is that their collapse is not something you cause. It is something you stop preventing. For a long time, your empathy, patience, and willingness to self-abandon acted as scaffolding for their emotional stability. When you remove that scaffolding, the structure cannot stand on its own, and that is when the illusion of power dissolves. This collapse does not always look like defeat on the surface. Sometimes it looks like arrogance turned up louder, confidence performed more aggressively, or narratives that paint you as the problem. But underneath, there is profound destabilization. They cannot regulate shame. They cannot tolerate accountability. They cannot integrate loss without externalizing it, and so they spiral. For you, the breaking of their control marks a turning point. You realize that peace was never possible while you were being managed rather than respected. You understand that your exhaustion was not weakness but a signal that something was fundamentally misaligned. As their tactics lose effectiveness, your clarity strengthens. You no longer personalize their reactions. You no longer feel responsible for their emotions, and in that space, your autonomy returns. Control collapses because it was never real. It was borrowed, extracted, maintained through fear and compliance. When you reclaim your agency, you expose the truth that their power depended on your participation. And once you see that, you stop feeding the dynamic altogether. You choose boundaries over chaos. You choose self-trust over self-doubt. You choose freedom over familiarity. And while the narcissistic person may continue searching for someone else to regulate their fragile identity, you move forward with a grounded sense of self that does not require domination to feel whole, and that shift changes how you relate to everyone and everything in your life from that point forward. When someone underestimates your strength, your boundaries, and your self-respect, they are not just misjudging you, they are revealing how narrowly they define power. In your life, this underestimation may have shown up as dismissal, entitlement, or the quiet assumption that you would always bend, forgive, explain, and stay. Narcissistic individuals often mistake patience for weakness, empathy for compliance, and loyalty for endless access. They believe your silence means consent, and your endurance means dependence. That belief becomes their greatest error. At first, you may not even realize you are being underestimated. You are simply trying to make things work. You are accommodating, understanding, and willing to give the benefit of the doubt. But over time, something shifts. You begin to notice how often your needs are minimized, how your boundaries are negotiated rather than respected, how your self-respect is subtly challenged through gaslighting, criticism, or emotional withdrawal, and slowly your internal compass starts recalibrating. The cost of underestimating you becomes clear when you stop negotiating your worth. Boundaries are not punishments, they are information. When you begin to set them without guilt or excessive explanation, it disrupts a dynamic that relied on your self-doubt. The narcissistic person expected you to remain available, flexible, and responsive. They did not account for your capacity to grow, to learn, to recognize patterns, and to choose yourself without theatrics. Self-respect is often quiet, and that is why it is underestimated. It does not announce itself. It shows up as consistency, as walking away when something no longer aligns, as refusing to engage in circular arguments designed to exhaust you, as understanding that being misunderstood is sometimes the price of being free. When you embody self-respect, you become unpredictable to someone who relied on your predictability. Strength in this context is not about dominance or confrontation. It is about containment. You hold your emotions without handing them over. You tolerate discomfort without abandoning your values. You allow other people to feel disappointed without rushing to fix it. That kind of strength is destabilizing to someone who assumed you would always prioritize harmony over integrity. The true cost of underestimating you is permanence. Once you see clearly, you cannot unsee it. Once you experience the peace that comes from honoring your boundaries, the old chaos loses its grip. The narcissistic person may attempt to reassert control through charm, guilt, or rewriting history, but the version of you who tolerated that no longer exists, not because you hardened, but because you healed. In your life, this becomes a turning point. You stop proving your strength and start protecting it. You stop explaining your boundaries and start enforcing them. You stop seeking validation from someone incapable of offering it. And the cost to them is irreversible access. They lose the version of you who absorbed the impact of their behavior so they would not have to face it themselves. Underestimating your self-respect means losing proximity to your growth, your presence, your energy, and your loyalty. And once that loss is felt, it cannot be undone because you have already moved into a life where your worth is not up for debate, and your boundaries are no longer invitations, but truths you live by every single day as you continue forward without needing their recognition or approval or understanding to remain grounded in who you are, and who you are becoming. Your growth does not announce itself. And that is precisely why it becomes so destabilizing to someone who once relied on having power over you. In your life, rising does not mean winning arguments or being seen as right. It means becoming less reactive, less available for chaos, less willing to abandon yourself for the sake of being chosen. While you are healing, learning, and strengthening your internal foundation, the narcissistic person is standing still, dependent on the same strategies that once worked but no longer do. What makes your rise a reckoning is that it happens without their permission. They expected your identity to remain tethered to their approval, their attention, their version of reality. Instead, you begin to define yourself independently. You cultivate self-trust. You develop emotional literacy. You understand patterns rather than personalizing harm. This kind of growth is invisible to someone who confuses dominance with depth and attention with intimacy. As you grow, you no longer offer the emotional reactions that once sustained the dynamic. You stop explaining your pain to someone who benefited from misunderstanding it. You stop hoping that empathy will awaken where accountability has always been avoided. And in that quiet withdrawal, something profound happens. You become unreachable to the mechanisms they use to regulate themselves. That is not abandonment. That is differentiation. For the narcissistic person, your growth exposes a truth they cannot integrate. They are not evolving, they are repeating, while you are expanding your capacity for reflection, boundaries, and emotional responsibility. They are doubling down on blame, denial, and control. This contrast is intolerable. It creates a mirror they cannot look into without confronting their own stagnation. And rather than grow, they externalize the discomfort. Your rise does not require you to confront them or prove anything. It is evident in the way you choose peace over intensity, in the way you prioritize consistency over chemistry, in the way you value mutual respect over emotional highs and lows. These choices signal a level of maturity that cannot be manipulated. And for someone who relies on manipulation to feel powerful, this feels like loss. The reckoning is not dramatic. It unfolds slowly. They realize they no longer have access to your inner world. They notice their tactics no longer land. They feel irrelevant to a version of you that is grounded, self-directed, and emotionally sovereign. And because their sense of self is built on being central, being needed, being superior, your independence becomes an existential threat. What you are reaching is not something they can follow you into. Growth requires humility. It requires accountability. It requires tolerating shame without outsourcing it. These are capacities they have not developed and may never choose to develop. And so your life moves forward, while they remain caught in cycles that feel familiar but empty. Your rise is not about leaving them behind. It is about arriving fully into yourself. It is about living in alignment with your values rather than reacting to someone else's wound. And while they may attempt to diminish, dismiss, or rewrite your growth to protect their ego, the truth remains unchanged. You are becoming someone who no longer fits inside the limitations they placed on you, and that realization reverberates long after you have stopped looking back and started building a life defined by self-respect, emotional clarity, and freedom that does not depend on anyone else's recognition or approval. At the end of all of this, what matters most is not what happened to them, but what happened to you. You did not emerge unchanged, but you emerged clearer. You learned that love without respect is not love. You learned that empathy without boundaries becomes self-erasure. You learned that peace is not found in fixing someone who refuses to look inward, but in choosing yourself consistently, even when it feels uncomfortable. What once hurt, you became the catalyst for discernment. What once confused you became information. What once kept you stuck became the very thing that pushed you into growth. And that growth is quiet, steady, and deeply rooted. It does not seek validation. It does not need an audience. It simply exists, shaping your choices, your relationships, and your future. They may never understand what they lost, because understanding would require accountability. But you understand what you gained. You gained autonomy. You gained emotional clarity. You gained the ability to walk away from dynamics that cost you your sense of self, and that is not something anyone can take from you. This is not about bitterness or triumph. It is about alignment. You are no longer available for cycles that diminish you. You are no longer negotiating your worth. You are living from a place of self-respect, and that becomes the foundation for everything that comes next.